is an image of the glory of the Sinaitic covenant. It ultimately fades, and the glory of the new covenant shines ever brighter. Let me just read those words to you from 2 Corinthians 3, verses 7 through 11. Now, if the ministry that brought death, how did it bring death? Well, when the Torah was given, immediately judgment began to come on Israel. Do a little study through the Torah one time, from the time of the Exodus till the end of the wilderness wanderings, and calculate, aside from all the Israelites who just died because they were 20 years and older and died in the wilderness, aside from Joshua and Caleb, just do a little count of how many were killed by plagues and other divine judgments. How many thousands? And then the result of our disobedience to Torah. Amos 3, God says to Israel, you only have I known, singled out of all the families of the earth, therefore I'll judge you for your iniquities. To whom much is given, much is required. So Paul says, if the ministry that brought death, which was engraved with letters on stone, came with glory, so that the Israelites could not look steadily at the face of Moses because of its glory, fading though it was, will not the ministry of the Spirit be even more glorious? If the ministry that condemns men is glorious, how much more glorious is the ministry that brings righteousness? For what was glorious has no glory now in comparison with the surpassing glory. And if what was fading away came with glory, how much greater is the glory of that which lasts? And look at how he ends, verse 17. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And we who with unveiled faces all reflect the Lord's glory are being transformed into his likeness with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. The second point, Paul clearly emphasized the surpassing greatness of God's new covenant, as expressed in 2 Corinthians 3, 7 through 11. And third, verses such as Isaiah 2, 1 through 4, do not contradict the position articulated here. There, in a picture of the Messianic age, where the mountain of the Lord's house is exalted above all the hills and mountains, the word of the Lord will go forth from Jerusalem. The front of my Tanakh here, Ki mitzion tetzei Torah, u'devar Adonai miYerushalayim. The Torah will go forth from Zion. The word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Only one thing, when I quoted it, I said the Torah. Actually, it doesn't say the Torah. Ki mitzion tetzei Torah. Teaching, instruction will go forth. A traditional Jew reads it and immediately thinks the Torah and all of the Jewish commentaries and all the Jewish traditions and everything that goes with it. It doesn't even say Ki mitzion tetzei ha-Torah, for from Zion will go forth the Torah, but Torah, teaching, divine instruction. This is not saying that in the Messianic era, God will call everybody back to obey what was written in the law of Moses, in particular with the Jewish commentaries and traditions. But Torah, as it's used in other places in Scripture, divine teaching, instruction, revelation, law, will go forth from Zion. Sermon on the Mount is Torah going forth, not the Torah of traditional Judaism, but Torah of the Messiah. So Isaiah 2, 1 through 4 does not contradict the position articulated here. Isaiah did not prophesy that in the Messianic age the nations would come flocking to Jerusalem to study the Pentateuch with the Messiah, much less to learn Talmudic traditions of the text, Talmudic interpretations, but rather that divine instruction would go forth from the Lord in Mount Zion and the nations would come flocking to it and to him. Undoubtedly, Paul would concur with this, also explaining that through the coming of the Messiah, we already have a glimpse of what will happen on that day and of how God's laws and statutes will be written on our hearts. Having moved forward, there is no reason to turn back. Again, the subject of Yeshua and the law and Paul and the law, this subject, everything it entails, it's quite massive. I spent considerable time going through it in Volume 4. But I believe we can see clearly it is not an issue of abolishing, doing away with. It is an issue of fulfilling and seeing ongoing application and purpose in a way that fulfills the whole intent of God from the beginning of time in this ongoing generation in which we live, to have a people for himself, Jew and Gentile, in love with him, worshiping him, knowing him, serving him, pleasing him. Before moving on to questions about the reliability of the New Testament documents, I just want to talk briefly about the Jewishness of the New Covenant writings. The Jewishness of these writings. And I mean Jewishness in two ways. I mean it in terms of it is thoroughly in keeping with biblical Israel, biblical expression, biblical thinking. And it also makes sense in the Jewish milieu of the day. It also makes sense against the Jewish background of the day almost 2,000 years ago. Let me point this out. The pages of the New Testament are filled with citations from the Hebrew Scriptures, with as many as 300 direct quotations from the Tanakh and several thousand allusions to the Hebrew Bible in the New Testament. Now listen to this. Some scholars claim that almost 1 out of every 3 verses in the New Testament, 1 out of every 3, in other words, 2,500 out of 8,000 verses, almost 1 out of every 3 contains a quote from the Tanakh or a general allusion of some kind. In other words, there's some reference back to something written in the Hebrew Scriptures or related to what's written in the Hebrew Scriptures or using the language of the Hebrew Scriptures or a direct quotation. As many as 1 out of every 3 verses. And you can quite solidly demonstrate that more than 10% of the New Testament is made up of citation or direct allusions to the Old Testament, quoting the words of some other scholars. Even on a conservative level, just saying, okay, I'm going to eliminate this, and just focus on these, more than 10%. And some would say as high as almost 1/3. In other words, the constant point of reference is back to the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew Scriptures, as it is written, as it is written, as it is written, as it is written. That's how they preached in the book of Acts. They learned that from the Master, from the Messiah himself. Now look at this. The book of Revelation contains 404 verses, most of which, as many as 331, are drawn from the imagery of the Hebrew Scriptures, although Revelation hardly ever directly quotes a specific verse from the Tanakh. It almost never quotes a specific verse. There's a reference to Psalm 2 in one place and possibly a reference, direct quote of another verse from the Hebrew Bible. Otherwise, it virtually never quotes the Hebrew Bible directly, but almost all the visionary imagery, the great majority of it, can be traced back to the pages of the Hebrew Bible. You jump from reading this, reading the Hebrew Scriptures, into reading the New Covenant writings. Yes, the letters of Paul are something new, something different in terms of a genre that was not seen primarily in the Hebrew Bible. In fact, it was not that well seen in ancient world. It's kind of a unique thing that grew out for these spiritual letters to have the impact they did. But then you read the quotes, you read the words, you read the method of thinking, you go, okay, going in the same direction here. Same God, same Scriptures. New Testament and Judaic literature scholar Craig Evans summarized the situation well. Quote, "The theology of the New Testament is fundamentally indebted to and a reflection of major Old Testament themes, images, and language. There is simply no significant element in New Testament theology that is not in some way a development of a tradition or theology